All right. Good morning again. I just noticed a really mean trick that they play on us preachers. I looked up at that clock that's up there above the sound room, and then I looked at my watch, and it's a good 3 or 4 minutes fast up there. Yeah. So that's a mean trick, because like I thought I'd really run over this morning. And I looked up, and I looked at my watch, and I got down here, and I was like, wow, this wasn't as bad off as I thought it was. That's a mean, I don't know who did that. It's probably pretty smart. Yeah, I was going to say, there were some people doing this. I don't know what that means. That's enough. I'm glad that you are here this morning as we get to have a little extended study. We're glad we have this opportunity. Take your Bible and turn to Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1. We are in the midst of a study using the word covenant. We looked at covenant foundations for about 6 weeks. Looked at that out of the book of Genesis, out of the book of Exodus. We looked at several different instances where God mentioned the concept of a covenant between He and His people. And then about 2 weeks ago, we transitioned to what we've kind of called covenant faithfulness. We've looked at some instances where God has been faithful to the covenant every single time, and humanity, for whatever reason, struggles with that sort of commitment. And we've looked at those examples, and we're going to look at one today that I think probably applies to many of us, but it's a positive one. It's a positive one. So Daniel chapter 1. As we begin, just sort of a side note thought. We use the term, and I used it this morning, and I'm not necessarily saying that it doesn't feel right to use it, but it does feel odd to use the term soldier, to use the term war when we're talking about our spiritual life, but it is appropriate. No matter how I might feel about that particular usage of the word, it is appropriate. It is scriptural. It is Bible-based to use those kinds of terms, to call ourselves soldiers in the army of God, or to talk about God as our commander. Those kinds of things are perfectly scriptural. Nothing wrong with them at all. But in so doing, you have to acknowledge then as a soldier that you're in a war. You're going to have to acknowledge that. And that's uncomfortable, I think, for some of us. I think we like to mosey through life as though basically it's all sunshine, rainbows, and unicorns. And, you know, our little moments of sadness, well, it's usually somebody else's fault. It's not mine. And I mean, I'm always a genuinely happy person, and I'm always a genuinely whatever person, and but I think there's times where we sort of forget that you're a soldier and you're in the midst of a war. Now, on the flip side of the coin, you got people that take it way too far. And they're looking to fight everybody in the parking lot. Your dress looks good this morning. You got something to say? Say it. Did you get a haircut? Oh, really? We're going to make fun of my haircut? All right, it's fine. No, you're not at a war with the people in your church family. Calm down. You're not at war with people on Facebook. Hello? Calm down. You are in a war, though, and it is worthy of being brought up. But the war you're in is a war against sin. Bottom line, I mean, if we really just want to get to the brass tacks of it, that's what you're in a war with. You're in a war with sin. You're in a war with temptation, and it's a war you're never going to stop fighting until you breathe your last breath. Now, you can try to ignore that. You can try to act like it's not real. And most of the time when we do that, we find ourselves in some really bad predicaments. Or you can acknowledge it. You can learn from what Scripture says about going into battles like this. And you can come out on the other side better for it. More committed, more faithful. And that's our idea today. If you look at Daniel chapter 1, we looked at Judah last week. We looked at some passages from Isaiah, some passages from Jeremiah. While these people are in exile, even while they're in exile, God expected the people of Israel to be his holy, set-apart nation. If you look at Jeremiah chapter 29, that is specifically what he tells them, verses 5 to 14. He specifically tells them through Jeremiah, I expect you to be my covenant people, even while you're in exile. Even while these Babylonians have overthrown you and taken you in captivity, and it's going to be 70 years. Even while that's going on, I fully expect you to remain faithful to our covenant, to our deal. Okay? Quick application. When you change jobs, does God expect you to remain faithful in your new job just as he did in your old job? Yes. When you move houses, does God fully expect your new house to be a house of faithfulness just like your old house was? Yes. When you lose a loved one, does God fully expect you on day one after the loss of that loved one to be as faithful as you were the last day that they were living? Absolutely. Absolutely. Today's March the 14th. This coming Friday will be 1 year since my grandmother passed away. Her birthday was this past Friday. She would have been 99 had she made it to this past Friday. This coming Friday will be 1 year since she passed. That woman was as faithful and devout of a Christian as you'll ever find on the face of this planet. I know we all say it about people in our lives. Doesn't make it any less true. If that woman doesn't get into heaven, the rest of us ain't got a shot. That kind of woman, right? We understand that. We've got people like that in our family. I can tell you with absolute certainty on the last 3 or 4 or 5 days of her life when she was unable to communicate with us, I guarantee you God expected us to be just as faithful as the 2 weeks before she passed when she asked us to sit in her living room and sing songs out of a songbook for her. Now, I will tell you this, one of the most moving, emotional moments for our earthly family is we were at her house. It was about the holidays time. It wasn't right up at the point of her death, but about the holidays last year. And she had asked my mom, who had stayed with her basically 24 hours a day, 4 or 5, 6 days a week. She had asked my mom, when all the kids get here and the grandkids get here, can you get them to sing? That's all I don't want any Christmas presents. I want them to sing. So Mom sends me a text and she says, here's the deal. You got to convince your brothers. You got to talk to your dad because Dad's a song leader. Dad's always been a song leader. He's been a song leader since the time he was about, born. But Dad now in his elderly years, he hates when I say that, by the way. So I'm hoping this gets out to him because I'll have a knuckle sandwich coming my way. You'll have to convince your dad. So I tell him, I'm like, look, this is what Granny wants. That's what we're going to do. Shockingly, every one of them were like, that's what we're going to do. So one of the most moving moments is sitting in her living room. We've got songbooks, and she requests Amazing Grace. Okay? Now, her lung function was very, very limited. She would have to take breaks in between every three or four words just to catch her breath. So we start singing Amazing Grace. And we'd already sung several songs, and she was just, beaming, We start singing Amazing Grace, and that 98-year-old woman begins to sing with us. Now, was she as faithful that day as she was the day she became a Christian? Oh, absolutely. Even more so, probably. Now, does God call us to faithfulness regardless of our earthly situation? The answer to that is yes. Mm-hmm. Sure. Right. It's going to be a wall between them and that. That's absolutely true. But does God call you to faithfulness? Yeah. My job, I don't like my boss. Or, he's mean to me or whatever. They mistreat me at work. Does God call you to faithfulness in those situations? Yes. The person that I am married to, or the person that I'm dating, the person that I'm with in a relationship, we're having our squabbles and our trouble. Does God still call you to faithfulness in that? Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's no way around that. So when you get to Daniel chapter 1, you've got a really intense situation here. Daniel, among others, has been taken captive. They've been brought into the kingdom of Babylon. And they are going to be pushed into labor, or they're going to be pushed into some type of service to these Babylonians. Now, I think there are a handful of things that you can notice about how to deal with this and how to remain faithful. Number one is look for God's sovereign hand during suffering. I would say this is a very difficult thing to do. Do you agree with that? To look for God's hand during suffering, is that hard to do? Why? Your focus is on other things. Naturally, as humans, what do we focus on in the midst of suffering? Getting better, getting well. You focus on the suffering, don't you? Isn't that where your human attention is drawn? Your human attention is going to be drawn to whatever it is that's causing the suffering, whether it be a physical illness, a mental illness, emotional problems. Whatever it is, you're going to focus on the suffering, which makes it hard sometimes to realize that you are not focusing on God and His hand during all this. If you look at Daniel's experience, look at verse 2 of Daniel chapter 1. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels, talking about Nebuchadnezzar. With some of the vessels of the house of God, he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of his food that the king ate, of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years. At the end of that time, they were stand before the king, and among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. Verse 8. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Verse 9, and God gave Daniel favor. God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. Now, through all of that, verses 1 all the way to verse 9, would it have been easy, and maybe perhaps we would be guilty of this, would it be easy to focus on the suffering rather than the sovereignty of God? Think about what's happening to these young men. Being forced out of their home, forced to travel a fairly great distance, forced into a training regiment that they are totally unfamiliar with, forced to learn a language, to read and study things that are not of their natural-born history, all by a king who says basically, your God doesn't matter to me. I don't really care about your God. So would it have been easy in this scenario, would it have been easy to focus on the suffering, to focus on the negativity, rather than to focus on the sovereignty of God? Sure. But yet, what do you see throughout all of this? What does verse 9 tell you? That throughout all of this, who was present? The Lord was present. Throughout all of this. You go back to Jeremiah 29. God told them, this is what's going to happen. But if you remember in Jeremiah 29, what's the verse in Jeremiah 29 that everybody loves? You remember what verse it is? It's verse 11. That starts this way, for I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. Everybody loves that verse. They just don't like the context. They don't like the fact that in that context, Jeremiah is telling them, hey, you're fixing to go away for a long time, 70 years. But God knows what plans he has for you in the midst of all of this. Is that not true here with Daniel? Is Daniel going to have, yes or no, is Daniel going to have a positive impact on every person that he comes in contact with? Yes or no? No. No, there are going to be some people that are going to hate him, aren't they? But is God with him throughout the entirety of this process? Oh man, there's no way you can get around that. How about Daniel chapter 6? When he's in the lion's den and those animals are pacing about. And the next morning, Daniel's sitting there as though nothing's happened. Because what? What happened? Yeah. Who did? God did. In a positive way, it's eerily reminiscent to Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20. Do you remember what happens in Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20? Who's your main character right there at the end of Genesis? Joseph. And in Genesis chapter 50, his father dies, and his brothers, who have now been living in, I would say, opulence, basically, for a while now because of Joseph's generosity, because of the generosity of the Pharaoh that Joseph served under, they've been living in a really nice setup for a while because of Joseph. But when his father dies, what do his brothers think? We're dead. He's waited until our father dies, and now he's going to kill every one of us. You remember that broke Joseph's heart. And in Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20, what does Joseph say about his experience? You meant it for evil, but what? But God meant it for good. Could Daniel not say the same thing here? Well, certainly he looked at some of those Babylonian oppressors and said, you guys mean this for evil, but you know what? God's going to make good out of this. So the first thing that we need to notice when it comes to our moments of suffering, our moments of pain, our moments of feeling like we're exiled, number one is to look for God's sovereignty in those moments. Is it possible? Is it possible? And the answer, of course, is yes. Is it possible that in the midst of those moments, God is preparing us for something greater? The answer is, of course, yes. I was watching something last night, and they had a quote on there, and I don't know who the quote's by, so I apologize. I'm on record for apologizing. I don't know who said it. But the person that said this quote, whoever it was, said, sometimes God takes things away so that he can replace it with something better. You ever felt that way? Maybe a relationship that went south and you thought, I don't understand, God. I thought this was it. I thought this was a great relationship, only for months down the road for you to meet someone else and all of a sudden that relationship, you didn't know what you did without it. How about in a job situation? Have you ever been working at a job and maybe something happens and they let you go? They downsize. They say, we got to get rid of your department. And you get in the car and you're not sure what to do with life because right now everything is upside down, and 2 weeks later something shows up. You ever just been through a bad day? And you just thought, man, today just is awful. You go to bed that night with a prayer on your lips. God, I'm just trusting you. And you wake up the next morning and all of a sudden some of those things that were maybe really heavy the day before are not as heavy the next day. You ever thought about that? In those moments, perhaps, you've gone through some things. You've gone through some momentary, for lack of a better term, exile, only to return better, stronger, more faithful. That happens when you begin to look for God's sovereign hand even in the midst of your suffering. You look at Daniel's example. Daniel stood up for those around him. You want to find a way to get through some exile, to get through some suffering. Seek the good of those around you. You'd be amazed at how, this is going to sound really cliche, but you'll be amazed at how much better you feel when you do good for others. I know that sounds cliche, but it is absolutely true. I know several of you in here, I'm looking around the room, several of you in here have been on mission trips. When you've gone on those mission trips, you've probably arrived, I'll just use me as an example, okay? That way I'm not accusing you of anything. But you might can agree with what I'm about to say. There have been times on mission trips where I've arrived at where we're going to do the mission work and I've thought, oh, I can't wait till this is over. Oh, it's hot or it's cold. I went one place, I won't say where it was, but I went one place, they forgot we were coming. We landed, got off the plane, we're looking for a van to pick us up, there's no van. We're looking for a taxi, for anything, a bus, something, there's nothing. So the guy that was leading our trip goes to a payphone, calls the number, and the guy goes, oh, man, my bad. Forgot y'all were coming. I remember thinking, I was a teenager, and I remember thinking, well, we might as well just get back on this plane and go back home. But can I tell you, by the end of that week, man, you're talking about feeling, I don't know, positivity. I don't know what the right word would be, but just feeling something better than what you were. On that particular trip, and I've told this story before, so I'll just give you the really brief version. That was the trip that I went on where they told us to avoid the Rastafarians as much as possible because they hated us and they hated the work of the church at that time. They said, do not talk to them, don't invite them to VBS, don't invite them to the gospel meeting because they're liable to physically assault you. And I was a teenager, and I was like, whoa, okay. I was really kind of scared. And I remember the first door that I knocked on was the Rastafarian's house. Way to go, Scott. Way not to pick up on signals as you walked up to the door. And he looked at me, and I looked at him, and I thought, so this is it. This is where I go in. It was a good life, a good run. A good run. This was it, though. And I had my little pink pieces of paper that were inviting people to VBS and gospel meeting crumpled up in my hand because I thought if he reads it, it's over. I'll die right here on the porch. And he asked me what I had in my hand, and I told him just nothing. It's just some paper. Because I was scared. Shouldn't have been, but I was scared. He said, well, what does it say on it? And I thought, oh, man. So I handed him one, and he brought his daughter every single night. He didn't stay. He refused to stay. He would drop her off, come back and pick her up. So can I tell you that trip started with me feeling like, oh, why are we here? You know, they didn't even know we were coming. They forgot. Yeah. By the time it was over, I didn't even want to leave. Just did some good for other people. You'd be amazed. You're going through a moment of suffering. You're kind of in your own personal exile. You start seeking the good of those around you, you'll be amazed how that'll make you feel. Because you will begin to see how God is blessing other people through you. He's using you to do that. And in so doing, you are fulfilling your part of the covenant. You are being His workmanship. If you get to we looked at verse 9. If you continue reading past verse 9, you know that the chief of the eunuchs comes to Daniel in verse 10 and says, I fear the king. I'm afraid of the king. Because he told me to feed you a certain diet and you guys aren't eating it. Look at what Daniel says, verse 11. Verse 12 is when he starts speaking. Verse 11, it tells you who Daniel's talking to. But verse 12, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat, water to drink. Let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So we listened to them in this matter, tested them for 10 days. You know the story. You know what happens here. At the end of 10 days, Daniel and those who were along with Daniel were better in appearance, fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. It's verse 17 that I want you to pay attention to, though. As for these 4 youths, now these are what we commonly refer to as Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But that's not fair. to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's not their names. This is Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. As for these 4 youths, verse 17, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Verse 19, the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were all in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. You got to let that sink in. Daniel's going to be in that position for decades. For decades. All because remaining faithful to God was of his utmost importance. So, you want to know how to deal with exile. You want to know how to deal with momentary affliction, suffering. You want to know how to deal with pain. You want to know how to deal with those times where you haven't held up your end of the covenant. Even though you know God is faithful in all things, you haven't held up your end. Well, it really boils down to this. Number 1, look for God's hand during those times. Number 2, seek the good of those around you. Number 3, remain faithful to God in all things. C.S. Lewis wrote one time, he who has God and everything else has no more than he who has God only. Let me read that again. Listen to this. He who has God and everything else has no more than he who has God only. Think about that. It sounds a whole lot like what Jesus said the cost of discipleship was. What would it be to gain the entire world yet lose your own soul? Okay, well, look at it from a positive light. If you have God, you've got all you need. Suffering reveals our functional hope and trust. That's difficult at times for us to stomach. Because it's in periods of suffering at times that we notice our hope isn't as it should be. Our trust isn't as it should be. We see clearly in suffering how often we run to the wrong things to find security, to find refuge, to find comfort. So the challenge is to ask ourselves these questions. What have I relied on as my hope apart from God? What experience, dream, or possession is my source of strength? Am I willing to resolve to remain holy to God in all things? If you go over to Hebrews chapter 11, you're going to find Daniel there. You're going to find him in verse 33. No, not by name. But you're basically going to find him defined in verse 33. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 33. Let's back up to verse 32 so we get the full context. What more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions. And you continue to read these things that happened. Quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so they might rise again to a better life. How about Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah? You will bow before this statue. No. No, our God can save us, but even if he does not, we will not bow down before your God. Nebuchadnezzar threw them in a fiery furnace, intending to kill them, for them to walk out. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging, even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with a sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy. There you go. There's your way to look at yourself as a Christian, as a child of God. The world is not worthy of you. For the true, faithful child of God. Wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. All these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. Here's the point that we want to wrap up with. It's nice to read those words, man. I'm going to tell you what, it's encouraging and it's inspiring to read those words, especially verse 33, dealing with what we're talking about today. But if that's where you stop, is at the end of that section, then you have missed the point. Because the point is revealed in verse 1 of chapter 12, where you find the word, therefore. In other words, this is what I said, and here's why I said it. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. And then you can read, I'm telling you what, you start reading chapter 12 and you'll be ready to run through a brick wall. Because after you've read about all of those things in Hebrews chapter 11 and you jump into chapter 12 and it talks about, therefore, let us run with endurance the race set before us. Therefore, let us throw off all of these things that hold us down. That includes suffering. That includes pain. That includes annoyance. Throw those things off and run the race. And then you get into chapter 12 and he starts talking about a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Woo! Like I said, you'll be ready to run through a brick wall. God's covenant. God has never failed his covenant. He's never going to. Not once. And the beautiful piece about it is that God in his infinite wisdom and his infinite grace has extended to us the opportunity to join him in that covenant. Yes, there are going to be times where you're going to struggle. There are going to be times where you're going to suffer. All humans will, all humans have, all humans will continue to do so. What is your response to that? Are you looking for God's hand in those moments? Or are you focused on the suffering? Are you seeking out ways to help others in those moments? Or are you, for lack of a better term, throwing a pity party? Are you remaining faithful to God in all things? Let that encourage you today. Let that challenge you today. If that's not what you've been doing, then you need to get back on the right track. The beautiful thing about God is God continues to stand there with his covenant, waiting on us to come home. And while we have breath in our lungs and our heart is still beating, we have opportunity to do so. Thank y'all for being here. Any comments before we dismiss? All right, thank y'all for being here. We'll see y'all this evening, 5 o'clock.